This is Bone Chillers to disturb your dreams. Dare to join us? Click subscribe, ring the bell. But remember, we cannot guarantee your safety from the nightmares that await. Prepare to be thrilled, chilled, and filled with a sense of dread you'll find nowhere else. Welcome to the darkness. We've been waiting.
The Skin Artist. In the dusky corners of Nevermore Street lies an ink-stained haven, the last tattoo parlor before the city swallowed its secrets into shadow. Run by the eccentric Sid, it attracted patrons lured by the mystery of his special ink. Sid was not just any tattoo artist, he was a skin artist. The ink he used was rare, mixed with substances known only to him. What made it special, however, was its pull to a nightmarish creature known only as the Rake. One night, a new face entered the parlor. Garbed in black, eyes full of purpose, this stranger demanded the special ink. Sid shrugged, knowing nothing of the man's intentions, and the needle danced on the stranger's back, crafting an intricate phoenix that seemed alive within the man's skin. As the days turned into weeks, a string of horrific incidents unfolded around Nevermore Street. The gruesome discovery of bodies, skin flayed off, leaving behind macabre exhibits of mortal horror. The authorities were baffled, the city paralyzed in fear. No pattern, no suspects, just the ink-stained specter of Sid's parlor casting long shadows. In the heart of the night, beneath the pale moonlight, Sid kept his parlor open. Fear was good for business, it drove people to ink their bodies as a talisman against the darkness. His conscience, however, gnawed at him, his dreams haunted by the Rake he'd always thought a myth. On a storm-ridden night, the stranger returned. His hollow eyes were framed with dread, his once vibrant phoenix now dull, as if drained of life. "What have you done?" he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "You must undo this." Confused, Sid could only mutter, "I just used the ink, man." Nothing more, but the stranger was insistent. "Not the ink. The Rake, it's real. You've summoned it. It's drawn to your ink, feeding on it." Unsettled, Sid's heart pounded in his chest as he understood the horrifying reality. The murders, the flayed bodies, it was all because of his ink. It wasn't merely the Rake's myth that was real, his attraction to the ink was a reality too. "No," Sid whispered. "This can't be real. You're lying." As if to answer his denial, a guttural snarl echoed from outside, a dreadful scratching against the back alley walls. The lights flickered, then died, shrouding the parlor in darkness. Then they saw it, the creature, horrific and real, its eyes burning with a sickly glow. The Rake. Driven by fear and guilt, Sid stumbled to his stash, pulling out a vial of pure, unmarked ink. He'd never used it, kept it hidden for its potency. In a desperate bid, he drew a protective sigil on the stranger's back, praying that it might repel the creature. The Rake howled in rage, lunging towards them. As its claws met the freshly inked sigil, it shrieked in agony, retreating. The sigil worked, but Sid knew this was not enough. He couldn't erase the tattoos, couldn't prevent the Rake from hunting those adorned with his ink. There was only one solution. With a shaking hand, he took the needle to his own skin, inking a larger sigil on his chest. He'd lure the Rake to himself. With a deep breath, he stepped out into the alley, his heart heavy with regret. He never came back, but the gruesome murders ceased. The city sighed in relief, stories about the skin artist fading into oblivion. On Nevermore Street, the abandoned parlor whispered tales of guilt and redemption, of a skin artist who summoned a monster and then became its prey, and of the Rake, who disappeared as mysteriously as it arrived, leaving behind a chilling legacy and an ink-stained nightmare. All that remained was a cryptic epitaph etched into the parlor's wooden door, inked in sin, redeemed in sacrifice.
Harvest of the Mind. Sarah Crowley, a brilliant neuroscience researcher, had spent years developing the Pneuma machine, a device designed to project thoughts into reality. Initially, its use was innovative and harmless: colorful daydreams, childhood memories, the complex architectures of imagined worlds. It was like a 3D printer for the mind, materializing abstract thoughts into touchable constructs. However, over time, Sarah began to grow bored with these benign manifestations. The thrill of seeing her whimsical daydreams morph into existence faded. One late evening, an unsettling curiosity took root. What would it be like to use her invention to harvest darker thoughts? Nightmares? Fears? Throwing caution to the wind, Sarah placed the headset on, connecting herself to the pneuma machine. She closed her eyes and allowed her mind to drift towards her deepest fears: monsters under her bed, shadowy figures in the corners of her eyes, nightmares that once made her heart pound in terror as a child. The pneuma machine hummed to life. As Sarah opened her eyes, she found herself standing face to face with an abominable creature, its body contorted in a disconcerting dance between reality and fantasy. It was grotesque, with sanguine eyes that radiated an insidious aura. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, yet an odd exhilaration sang in her veins. She had just given birth to her darkest thoughts. Her horror, her creation, stood before her. Days morphed into weeks, and Sarah spent them birthing more horrors from the shadowy recesses of her mind. Yet, they remained her creations, and they could not harm her. They were monstrous, but they were confined within the walls of her lab. But one morning, she woke up to an unimaginable sight. Her bedroom was infested with tiny shadowy figures, grotesque caricatures she had formed in her lab. The line between her thoughts and reality had blurred. Sarah could feel her heartbeat in her throat. How had they escaped? Realizing the severity of the situation, Sarah raced to her lab, her mind racing. The pneuma machine was running rampant, humming in an ominous rhythm. Terrifying creatures were wriggling out of it, extending their ghastly forms to the real world, unchecked and unsupervised. Sarah needed to end this, but how? She considered destroying the machine, but a thought held her back. If the pneuma machine was destroyed while projecting a thought, the said thought could be permanently stuck in reality. The implications were unthinkable. Her only hope was to reverse this process somehow, to use the machine to dematerialize these horrors. With a shaking hand, Sarah donned the headset once more. She closed her eyes, focusing on the creatures she had created. This time, she didn't imagine them as gruesome, terrifying beasts. She envisioned them fading away, turning to wisps of smoke, and then to nothingness. As Sarah focused, the pneuma machine flickered and whirred. One by one, the creatures shuddered and shrunk, their menacing forms dissolving into thin air. A sigh of relief escaped Sarah's lips, and she finally removed the headset. The nightmare was over. Her creations were gone. Her mind was finally at peace, or so she thought. That night, as Sarah turned off the lights, ready to enjoy her first peaceful night in weeks, she saw it. There, in the darkest corner of her room, lurked a pair of sanguine eyes, a remnant from the depths of her mind. Though she had managed to erase the physical forms of her terrors, their essence still lingered, trapped within the confines of her mind and the corners of her reality. She could no longer distinguish between her mind's fabrications and the tangible world. The harvest of her mind had grown too bountiful, too wild, its roots delving too deep into her reality. Sarah had dared to sow the seeds of her darkest fears into the fabric of reality. Now she was doomed to live with the grim reaping of her mind's harvest, forever haunted by her own terrifying creations. The line between the imagined and the real had been shattered, leaving Sarah in a world where her fears had become her constant companions. She was left to wander in the haunting labyrinth of her mind's making, the horror of her own harvest. The sanguine gourmet, Lydia had always been fascinated by the culinary world. Her passion led her to the doorsteps of the esteemed Le Cordon Bleu in Paris, an institution synonymous with gourmet excellence. But her most unusual find was not at the school but tucked away in an old bookstore, an ancient, dust-covered cookbook titled Le Gourmet Sanguine. Curiosity piqued, Lydia purchased the book, and soon found herself engrossed in its pages. The book was filled with bizarre recipes and rituals involving peculiar ingredients such as raven feathers, wolfsbane, and lunar salt. Intrigued by the strangeness of it all, she decided to recreate the dishes. In the beginning, she laughed off the strange feelings, the unusual cravings, but they soon became impossible to ignore. After cooking a particularly old recipe, sauce a yusang, she experienced an irresistible compulsion. The taste of the sauce, rich and metallic, had triggered something within her. It was a craving not for simple, ordinary fare, but something more carnal, human flesh. A torrent of guilt washed over Lydia as she acknowledged her dark craving, but her rational mind was gradually subdued by her newfound hunger. Her first victim was a vagrant, an old man who drifted into Paris from the colder parts of France. It was a quick, merciful end. She prepared her first human meal with the meticulous care of a true culinary artist, suppressing her guilt with the thrill of the new ingredient. Her crimes were sophisticated, her victims chosen with discretion, her culinary creations more delectable than any she had previously made. Her dishes, showcased at the student exhibitions, were highly praised for their exotic taste, drawing attention from the school's renowned chefs. But as the praises piled on, so did the bodies. Lydia had become a culinary-focused serial killer, her psyche enslaved by the malevolent force within the cookbook. Her once bright eyes were now cold, reflecting a predatory glint. One day, the local authorities discovered the remains of one of her victims. They found traces of exotic ingredients around the mouth and under the nails. The police were baffled, the city terrified. Meanwhile, Lydia remained calm and collected, her monstrous cravings hidden behind the facade of an aspiring chef. But as the investigation deepened, Lydia found herself caught in a web of her own making. The police discovered a connection between her culinary creations and the gruesome murders. Just as the noose was about to tighten around her, the ancient cookbook revealed a final recipe, Le Dernier Repas, the Last Supper. The ingredients were horrifying, requiring the flesh of the cook herself. In a terrifying revelation, Lydia realized that the cookbook had been grooming her, not merely to become a killer, but as the ultimate ingredient in its diabolic gastronomic scheme. A sense of dread overwhelmed her as she comprehended the finality of the ritual. But her desire to cook, to serve the perfect meal, was so deeply rooted that she found herself powerless against the call of the final recipe. With a trembling hand, she prepared the dish, each slice of her flesh a tribute to her perverse journey. She cooked with a grim determination, mixing her blood, sweat, and tears into the concoction. It was a masterpiece of morbid culinary art, the peak of her macabre skill. As she served her last creation to her unsuspecting classmates and teachers, she watched them relish each bite with a sick satisfaction. It was her final bow, the ultimate applause, even as her lifeblood drained away, and her vision blurred into darkness. In her last breath, Lydia finally understood the cost of her relentless pursuit of exotic culinary excellence. The Le Gourmet Sanguine had claimed another victim, turning a promising young culinary student into a monstrosity, a sanguine gourmet. The book vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared, ready to surface somewhere else, awaiting its next unwitting apprentice. Phantom Melodies. Serena, a concert violinist known for her virtuosity, had a passion for rare and historic instruments. When she received a violin rumored to have belonged to a devil's disciple, her curiosity was instantly piqued. The instrument, imbued with an age-old aura, was made of ebony wood and was graced with intricate designs that seemed to move, almost like living entities. She felt a shiver run down her spine as she held it. Intrigued by its menacing allure, Serena began to practice with the violin. Its rich, haunting melodies filled her solitary practice room. An ethereal beauty radiated from the notes, unlike anything she'd ever experienced. Serena was captivated. She played for hours, losing herself in the mesmerizing melodies. It wasn't long before Serena was to perform at her next concert. Filled with a newfound excitement, she decided to introduce her audience to the enchanting sound of her new violin. As she walked onto the stage, the spotlight illuminating her graceful figure, the crowd fell into a hushed anticipation. Serena brought the bow to the strings, and the phantom melodies cascaded through the concert hall. The audience was spellbound, their eyes locked onto the young prodigy. The enchanting tones emanated an unworldly power that seemed to mesmerize and consume the listeners. A sudden sharp gasp broke the eerie silence. A well-dressed man in the front row collapsed onto the floor. Then, like a wave washing over the audience, more spectators fell, clutching their chests. A chorus of screams filled the hall as panic erupted. Unaware of the commotion, Serena played on, the hypnotic melodies resonating from her violin. Only when she finished the piece, she lifted her eyes to witness the horror. The auditorium was strewn with lifeless bodies, the remaining audience members frozen in terror. Shocked and grief-stricken, Serena sought to understand the calamity. The only common factor was the haunting music from the devil's violin. Fearing its power, she locked the instrument away, hoping to contain its malevolent influence. Yet, the violin sang in the dead of night, its eerie tune seeping from its confinement. The melodies wound their way to the ears of Serena's neighbors, and by dawn, her entire street was found dead, their faces twisted in a mix of terror and serenity. Frantic and desperate, Serena decided to destroy the instrument, to silence its deadly music forever. But as she tried to burn it, the flames danced around the violin, refusing to consume it. The instrument remained unscathed, and its melodies grew louder, filling her with an irresistible urge to play it. In her desperation, she sought out the advice of a renowned historian, who revealed the dark history of the violin. It was crafted by a demonic artisan, who signed a pact with the devil to make the most enchanting instrument. The cost? The souls of its listeners. You must not play it again, the historian warned. But if the music refuses to be silenced, then there is only one course. Which is? Serena asked, a shiver running down her spine. You must challenge the devil himself to a duel of melodies. You must outplay him with his own instrument, Serena. It's the only way to break the curse. Determined, Serena spent days mastering the violin's grim songs. When she finally summoned the devil, her challenge was met with a twisted smile and a gleeful acceptance. The duel was like nothing the world had ever witnessed. The air crackled with the energy of their notes. Serena played with a fervor, the phantom melodies echoing around them. The devil countered with discordant, maddening tunes, trying to sway her, but Serena remained steadfast. Finally, exhausted but resolute, Serena performed a composition filled with purity and love. The sweet melody danced in the air, wrapping itself around the devil's chaotic tune and silencing it. In that moment, the devil roared in frustration, the contract shattered. The violin let out a final, mournful note before it crumbled to ashes. In the quiet that followed, Serena stood victorious. She had played the phantom melodies and won, saving countless souls from the deadly allure of the devil's instrument. While her music would never be the same, her listeners could finally appreciate her gift, free from the spectral note's deadly embrace. The Weaver of Shadows. Emily was a young and lonely soul. She took solace in the art of textile work, her hands creating stories with every thread she wove. Inheriting her grandmother's dilapidated house after her passing, Emily discovered an antique loom in the attic, its dark, polished wood begging to be used. Hidden in the shadows and dust, the loom possessed an eerie grandeur, decorated with intricate carvings of spectral figures, each one seemingly locked in a dance with shadows. It was old and ornate, unlike anything Emily had ever seen. A pull towards the loom began to tingle her fingers, her artistic sensibilities beckoned by its allure. She soon found herself spending every waking hour with the loom, weaving threads with an intensity she had never known. Her first piece was a landscape, a shadowy forest under a moonlit sky. But as she pulled the final thread, something was different. Her creation seemed almost too real, the moon seemed to glow, and the shadows flickered and danced. She dismissed the odd sensation as a trick of the light, a mere result of her exhaustion. But, the next morning, she found her once peaceful neighborhood enshrouded in a dark, impenetrable fog, chillingly similar to her woven piece. As Emily continued to weave on the ancient loom, her creations began to mirror themselves into reality. A woven storm brought about tempestuous winds and torrential rain. A starless night sky resulted in an unending darkness. Each woven nightmare breathed life into the mundane world around her, inflicting an omnipresent terror. Rather than fear, Emily felt an intoxicating power surge within her. The ability to create, to manipulate the world around her with a mere shuttle and thread, was intoxicating. So, she succumbed to the seduction of the loom, each weave pushing her deeper into the realm of horror she had unlocked. Emily began to weave with a frenzied delight, painting horrifying images of grotesque beasts and haunted visages onto the textile canvas. Her once vibrant town was thrown into chaos as her tapestries of terror came to life, one after the other. Yet Emily remained trapped in her grandmother's house, intoxicated by the power she held over her threads, oblivious to the fear that had consumed the people around her. One night, Emily decided to weave a self-portrait. She meticulously worked the loom, shaping her image in threads of grey and black. But, as she pulled the final thread, she felt a sudden and sharp pain in her chest. Looking down, she saw her body fading, her skin taking on the hue of the thread she had used to weave her image. In horror, she realized she was becoming a part of her woven world of shadows. Fighting against the surging pain, she stumbled towards the mirror. Her reflection was waning, her once vibrant eyes now hollow, her body fading into the shadows. The loom had seduced her into weaving her own nightmare. In her terror, Emily raced back to the loom, her hands trembling as she began to unravel her self-portrait. Each pull brought another stab of pain, but with it, a slow return to reality. The town returned to its peaceful silence, the eerie darkness lifted, and the shadows receded. And, slowly, Emily regained her form. As the first light of dawn spilled through the attic window, Emily looked at the loom. It stood silently, the spectral figures etched into the wood seeming to smirk back at her. She realized then the cost of her unchecked power. The loom's alluring promised nothing but a treacherous illusion. Exhausted and trembling, Emily dismantled the loom, burying its pieces deep in the attic. But even as she returned to her usual weaving, the whisper of the loom echoed in her mind, a constant reminder of the horror she had woven into reality. Emily had become the weaver of shadows, her talent now a chilling memory of the terror she could create with a simple thread.
Thank you for watching, and remember, the darkness awaits. Until our paths cross again, stay fearful and stay subscribed.